To see a world in a grain of sand, and a heaven in a wild flower. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour.
The man who wrote those lines was an 18th century poet and painter who set out to change our very perception of reality, to see beyond time and space to the eternal world of the spirit.
If the doors of perception were cleansed, then everything would appear as it is, infinite.
He saw angels and conversed with Old Testament prophets.
I give you the end of a golden string. Only wind it into a ball, and it would lead you in at heaven's gate.
But William Blake was more than a dreamer on the margins. Born into violent political times, he was a revolutionary patriot who was almost hanged for treason. He was ridiculed by his countrymen, but his vision of England was of a promised land, with himself as its national poet and prophet. William Blake's most famous poem, Jerusalem, set to music in the First World War, has become a hymn to an idealized Britain, an alternative national anthem. But what today brings a warm glow to promenaders was intended as something very different. The anguished lament of a man crying in the wilderness, and a radical plea for a return to a lost and sacred past.
Blake is a prophet figure. He is articulating the energies at the moment of the nation. He is decrying what's happening. He looks to the past, but he also looks to the future. And what you get in Blake is this visionary sense of the island nation, its history, its dream time, and what the nation might become. He's one of the guardian spirits of the island nation, and he carries that like a great Old Testament prophet.
It could not be said of any other English writer that he was our national prophet. He is the most important influence in transforming national consciousness which we have.
Blake's sense of himself as guardian of the nation's soul was founded on a fanatical belief in his own mission.
He regarded himself as marked out by fate. He was more or less despised and rejected by his contemporaries, who saw nothing much in his art and absolutely nothing in his poetry. So for the sake of his own sanity, for want of a better word, we can see that he decided very early on that his was a very special vision, and that his work, as he said it, was in the context of eternity.
Though I laugh at fortune, she alone is the governor of worldly riches. When it is fit, she will call on me. Till then, I wait with patience. If on earth neglected, I am in heaven a prince among princes.
Some people think of him as the greatest genius who's ever lived. Other people think of him as a kind of Mr. Nutty and an eccentric who really could be ignored. On the one hand, he's somebody who has given us some of the most beautiful literature in the world and some of the most arresting paintings. And yet, on the other hand, he is somebody who is very much enclosed inside a personal vision.
Blake's paintings and poetry depict a mythic drama of religion, politics, sex, and the supremacy of man's imagination. He lived his life in poverty, dependent for work on sympathetic patrons whom he often resented.
Throughout Blake's life, he had to work with his hands and to prepare copperplate for engraving and etching. He worked for other men for many, many years and was entirely dependent upon that kind of day-to-day copy work, as it was called. Not original work, but copy work after other artists, and feeling himself to be a true and original artist, and often an artist of much greater importance than those whose works he had to copy.
God appears and God is light to those poor souls who dwell in night, but does a human form display to those who dwell in realms of day. I think Blake has helped to change. In fact, I would use the word transform my life, actually, more than change. Because when you maybe feel like you're getting a little bit beaten by the whole process. For me personally, that means, my music deserves to be heard by a much bigger audience. It's not, And you just think, well, Blake's works of art are only appreciated by a mere handful of people. Tough. You do it because you do the art. Because it's a prayer. It's a form of prayer, ultimately. That's what it is. And that's why you do it. You do it because you've got to do it. So he brings me back into harmony every day.
Blake's sense of his own uniqueness was rooted in the visions he saw. The first at the age of 6, when he saw angels in a tree on Peckham Rye.
In great eternity, every particular form gives forth or emanates its own peculiar light, and the form is in the divine vision, and the light is his garment. This is Jerusalem in every man.
On the surface, it would seem that he was, in a literal sense, mad. He saw visions, he spoke to angels, his behavior was on occasions erratic, but I prefer to see it as part and parcel of his unique visionary capacity. He was a man who felt himself to be singled out by fate. He was a man who believed that he was peculiarly blessed, both artistically and creatively. And the visions which he saw were, in a sense, real. They were certainly real for him.
When the sun rises, do you not see a round disk of fire, somewhat like a guinea? Oh, no, no. I see an innumerable company of heavenly hosts crying, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty.
I think he really did see things. It's a bit more of a question of what he actually thought they were. He certainly used them as a way to encourage himself, and maybe the isolation of Blake, because I don't really think he had any very close personal friends, or at least not in his adult life, that isolation might almost have caused him to have a kind of dialogue with his visions. He said that there was a man who taught him paintings in his dreams, for example. That's typical of Blake, that the vision is instructing him, the vision is telling him what to do.
We must converse with eternal realities as they exist in the human imagination. We are in a world of generation and death, and this world we must cast off if we would be painters.
You know, when you read Blake, the great thing real art has, it takes fear away. The fear diminishes with great art. You go into a new situation and you feel very vulnerable. And you're in this very adult world, suddenly you feel like a little child. Suddenly a Blake couplet will come to mind. Something like Infant Sorrow. My mother groaned, my father wept. Into the dangerous world I leapt. Helpless, naked, piping loud, like a fiend hid in a cloud.
William Blake was born in Soho, London, in 1757, the son of a hosier. His parents were nonconformists, and from them, Blake inherited a hatred of official religion and an equally passionate devotion to the Bible.
When he was a child, he read the Bible, or it was read to him, and the images from the scriptures never deserted him. He returns again and again to the Bible as a source of inspiration.
His baptism at St. James, Piccadilly was the first and virtually the last time he ever entered an established church.
He was someone upon whom no authority could impose itself. So any kind of religion which entailed commandments and disciplines and symbolic order was one which he fled from.
He comes from a sort of dissenting tradition. The dark satanic mills in the hymn Jerusalem could have been the Church of England, and I think he had a fairly clear view that established religion of his time was a very oppressive and soulless organization which kept people firmly in their place.
I went to the Garden of Love and saw what I never had seen. A chapel was built in the midst, where I used to play on the green. And the gates of his chapel were shut, and thou shalt not writ over the door. So I turned to the Garden of Love, that so many sweet flowers bore. And I saw it was filled with graves, and tombstones where flowers should be. And priests in black gowns were walking their rounds, and binding with briars my joys and desires.
Sin and redemption just don't come into it with Blake. For him, the divine humanity, whom he called Jesus the Imagination, that was the name he gave to Jesus, the Imagination. And it's the eternal Christ within man, the power of imaginative awareness that concerned him. And he speaks continually not of sin and redemption, but of sleep and awakening.
His interest in religious imagination springs from his sense that the whole world was instinct with the power of spirit, that he believed in firm outlines. He talked about the clarity of outlines, which are the lines of the imagination. For him, the world was suffused by revelation and lamentation.
While still a boy, Blake experienced something which was deeply to affect the way he saw the world. Apprenticed to an engraver, he was sent to draw the ancient tombs in Westminster Abbey. In the long hours sketching in the chapel of Edward the Confessor, he fell in love with the Gothic style, its simplicity and purity and aura of the sacred.
He sees Gothic as being organic, something that grows like a tree, and he sees the lovely flowing lines of the Gothic, which of course were one of the glories both of the buildings and sculptures in Gothic cathedrals, that wonderful soaring effect they have. He sees that as being something to do with living form. He sees it as almost the stone coming alive and flowing, that wonderful organic sense. It does seem as though the early experience with Gothic art was something that helped Blake to develop his particular sense of this living, flowing line.
The Abbey gave him something else as well, a powerful sense of an ancient, sacred English history, which had been lost in the glare of 18th century scientific enlightenment. Blake's mystical nationalism was not unique among artists of the day, though he was uniquely passionate.
There was a great nostalgia, passion for what was known as Albion, the original state of England, or, as Blake saw it, the spiritual state of England. He once engraved an image of Joseph of Arimathea, who was supposed to have come to this country, this great mythical figure, bearing the Holy Grail with him containing Christ's blood, and established a chapel in Glastonbury. This is all of a piece with his interest in the Druids, in the name of Albion, which was the ancient name of England, and in Stonehenge, by which he was fascinated and preoccupied for most of his life. It's to do with his reverence for the old art, the old order of England, not a feudal order, but a sort of sacred spiritual order. The antiquarian passion and the radical tradition are all of a piece in the sense of trying to rediscover some ancient source of liberty and freedom, and also some ancient source of spirituality.
Blake was a Londoner, and he took images of the city being built around him, transforming them into a mystical geography of England as the New Jerusalem.
The fields from Islington to Marylebone, to Primrose Hill and St. John's Wood, were builded over with pillars of gold, and there Jerusalem's pillars stood. Pancras and Kentish town repose among her golden pillars high, among her golden arches which shine upon the starry sky.
What Blake does is he takes London, he takes areas of England, and he builds them into his vision so that he's created this ideal countryside, ideal city. And Loss and Enetharmon rose over the hills of Surrey. Their clouds roll over London with a south wind. Soft Uthon pants in the vales of Lambeth, weeping o'er her human harvest. He's not a realist, he's an idealist. It's a redemptive vision.
For Blake, Chaucer, Spenser, Milton, these were the great native poets. And he looked across down the decades of the 18th century to the last great bardic figure in his estimation, Milton, blind, writing Paradise Lost, maintaining this national responsibility, the soul of Albion.
Blake turned these dreams of a sacred England into a series of epic poems, in which the fate of the nation is woven into the story of the Bible and myths of Blake's own invention. But at the new Royal Academy, a very different vision of England and English art was being nurtured under Sir Joshua Reynolds. Ever the outsider, Blake took a violent dislike to Reynolds and his insistence that artists learn by copying the example of the great painters of the past.
Blake is all for inspiration and original genius. From Reynolds' point of view, Blake is a dangerous maniac. He's somebody who could undermine the whole thing. He's the kind of person who gives art a bad name.
For an artist with a passion for the Gothic style, the Royal Academy was not the place to be.
From the point of view of the Academy, classical art or Grecian art was the paradigm. That was the art that was full of all the proportions that you needed for a good work of art. Now, Blake sees this as mathematics, something that's all about measurement and mathematics.
For Blake, the Academy was a symbol of all that was wrong with the 18th century world. Rational, soulless, and enthralled to the new discoveries of science.
The great enemies in Blake's world, the delimiting forces of logic, of ratio, and of reason. He was against mathematical relation. He was against any form of logical progression. His principal enemy, for example, was Sir Isaac Newton, whom he believed to have severely misconstrued the nature of the universe.
Blake took Newton to be one of the embodiments of cold science, which doesn't take into account imagination.
Blake's portrait of Newton was unconventional.
There's this great scientist sitting naked on a rock, and he's bending down with a pair of compasses, and he's doing a mathematical calculation of some sort. And he's very, very concentrated on this, incredibly concentrated on this mission. And then as you look at the painting, you see, what's he sitting on? He's sitting on some rock. But it's not just rock. It's sort of multicolored. It's covered with sort of kind of mossy underwater sea growths of incredible beauty. I mean, what he's sitting on is really an amazing abstract painting. Very complex, and very extraordinary, and very alive. He doesn't even know it. So he's doing this diagram. He's doing a diagram, and diagrams are useful but dead in themselves. And he's sitting on this organic thing. It's like those guys who used to go along and land on a whale thinking it was a desert island and light a fire, and then the whale would like that and they'd drown. Those stories, it's like that. I mean, Newton's in for a shock.
For Blake, the universe is alive. The essence of his teaching is summed up in very simple words. Everything that lives is holy. And that is the great difference between the living universe and the mechanistic universe in which nothing is living and nothing is holy.
To see a world in a grain of sand, and a heaven in a wildflower. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour.
Blake's view of the world was visionary, but it was also precise. He always claimed that his visions were clear and distinct, and that his art simply reflected what he saw.
A spirit and a vision are not, as the modern philosophy supposes, a cloudy vapour or a nothing. They are organised and minutely articulated beyond all that the mortal or perishing nature can produce. He who does not imagine in stronger and better light than his perishing mortal eye can see, does not imagine at all.
Blake's visual style is marked by a very precise line, a very beautiful flowing line. He talks himself about the bounding line. His visions seem to accord with his actual painting style, the actual sharp way in which he worked.
He called the style of painting since the Renaissance, and its fascination with light and shadow, the school of blotting and blurring. His hero was Michelangelo, with his vigorous line and love of the holy and heroic.
Probably that very beautiful line that he has does come from his experiences as an engraver. He was a copper engraver, and for copper engraving, of course, you have to have a very clear, fine line. And in a way, this is where his art begins.
Blake set up as an engraver and took lodgings in Soho. But life was hard, and his poetry and painting had to be squeezed into his few spare hours. Then, according to Blake, his dead brother Robert appeared to him in a vision and showed him a way he could unite all his skills.
Blake brought all of these disparate specialist tasks, including the artwork and the writing of the poems, into his own studio, and conceived of a method which was highly innovatory. Instead of in conventional etching, where you break through the ground with a needle showing the polished surface and etch those areas, with Blake's process, you bite away, you corrode all of the surface of the copper plate except the writing and design, which ends up standing proud.
Blake's claims for his new method, in which he was able to draw both text and picture directly onto the same plate, were typically fantastic.
The author has invented a method of printing in a style more ornamental, uniform and grand than any before discovered. Even Milton and Shakespeare could not publish their own works.
For Blake, his new method of relief etching had a sacred, even mystical meaning.
This is printing in the infernal method, by corrosives, melting apparent surfaces away and displaying the infinite which was hid.
One of the first fruits of Blake's new method was the Songs of Innocence and Experience, published in 1794.
The songs are very beautiful, very simple, very complex lyrics, which represent innocence, a childlike vision of the world. And then a higher vision, which is experience, which has all sorts of difficult experiences within it, and suffering and sin and guilt and cruelty and exploitation of other people, but is a transitional stage towards a higher kind of being.
Arose thou art sick, the invisible worm that flies in the night in the howling storm, has found out thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love does thy life destroy.
It's the absolute succinct clarity of the poems, with a rhythm that comes out of the life of the common people, out of ballads and songs. And that what he does in the poems is through the use of just a few images to suggest complex human relationships.
I was angry with my friend. I told my wrath did end. I was angry with my foe. I told it not, my wrath did grow. And I watered it in fears, night and morning with my tears, and I sunned it with smiles, and with soft deceitful wiles.
What's fascinating about these lyrics is they're like tiny psychological myths. A Poison Tree is a poem about friendship. If you're really friends with somebody and they anger you, you express your anger. You have a row. Your friendship's stronger for it. If you're friendly with somebody, but you don't really trust them, and they offend you, the reaction often is to bury the offence, where it festers in your subconscious, and then out it comes when your so-called friend least expects it.
And it grew both day and night, till it bore an apple bright, and my foe beheld it shine, and he knew that it was mine. And into my garden stole, when the night had veiled the pole. In the morning glad I see my foe outstretched beneath the tree.
One of the many special things about Blake is that he wrote for everyone. When friends of mine have babies, I always give them a copy of the Songs of Innocence and Experience, illuminated by Blake, and it lasts them a lifetime. You can sing the Songs of Innocence and Experience to babies, and you can read them when you're 99, I think. And they mean different things at different ages, those poems, but they have a very simple surface, and underneath there are layers and layers and layers and layers, and you never get to the bottom of them. You're never left thirsty by them.
Blake married Catherine Butcher, a gardener's daughter, after the briefest of courtships. She was a tolerant, even enthusiastic partner in Blake's eccentricities.
Once a visitor found him and his wife sitting naked in the garden, claiming to be Adam and Eve. And in a way, you might say that image of paradise before Adam and Eve were driven out into the world sticks in his mind, the earthly paradise, in a kind of sexual bliss.
The pride of the peacock is the glory of God. The lust of the goat is the bounty of God. The nakedness of woman is the work of God.
Blake's attitude towards sex is peculiar. Again, one of the many contradictions of his nature, in that he maintained a monogamous and, as far as we can tell, faithful union with his wife Catherine over many years. They were never parted even for one day. And yet in his imagination there is a riot of pornographic and orgiastic imagery which suggests that he had either a thwarted nature or that his imagination was, as we would expect, much stronger than his hold upon the real world.
What is it men in women do require? The lineaments of gratified desire. What is it women do in men require? The lineaments of gratified desire.
He has a very lively erotic imagination. In Jerusalem, his last great poem, the coming together of Albion and Jerusalem in the end is a sexual coupling which will lead to the final paradise. One of the most beautiful images of coupling are the couple embracing in a lily. The lily seems to be almost like a vulva, and you can see the figures, they're almost as though they're being born from the lily as well as coupling.
He believed theoretically in free love, certainly. Well, there are all sorts of stories about Blake sort of proposing a kind of open marriage to Catherine, Kate. And she thought this was a rotten idea. So he gave it up. That's okay. He loved her. He taught her to read and write, and she got to work with him. And I think it was a very good marriage. So without Kate, I mean, he might have gone mad. I don't know.
Catherine was one of the very few people to get close to the reclusive Blake.
Blake was, in large part, a mystery to his contemporaries. He could be very shy, he could be very bashful, very awkward. On the other hand, when he was aroused, he could be very combative and angry. But there were times also when he said things simply for effect. There are many stories, of course, of his saying, "I saw an angel the other day," or "I was talking to the prophet Ezekiel the other day." Now, it's very hard to say whether that was a genuine remark or whether he was simply saying it to provoke attention.
Pray, Mr. Taylor, did you ever find yourself, as it were, standing close beside the vast and luminous orb of the moon?
Not that I remember, Mr. Blake. Did you ever?
Yes, frequently. And I've felt an almost irresistible desire to throw myself into it headlong.
I think, Mr. Blake, you had better not. For if you were to do so, you most probably would never come out of it again.
In 1791, Blake and Catherine moved across the river to Lambeth, where Blake set up his studio in Hercules Buildings. The surrounding streets became drawn into his poetic vision.
There is a grain of sand in Lambeth that Satan cannot find, nor can his watch fiends find it. Every angle is a lovely heaven, which should the watch fiends find it, they would call it sin, and lay its heavens and their inhabitants in blood of punishment.
Blake was a Cockney. He was very stocky, of a typical London type. He dressed like a tradesman all his life. If you met him in the street, you would have assumed he was what he was, a London artisan. A strange mixture of the mundane and the visionary. London in those days was a city without system, in which all forms of eccentricity and individuality could flourish. It was a city of mobs, too. It was a city of casual daily violence. In fact, when visitors came to London, they remarked upon the violence of the streets, the amount of prostitution, and the amount of poverty. And he used London like a vast symbolic theatre. In fact, London emerges as a great landscape of horror and terror. One only has to read a poem like London to understand how much he pitied and sorrowed over the plight of London and Londoners.
I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mind-forged manacles I hear.
Of course, in his day, London was actually much smaller. But he'd walk out from the West End, like from Stratford and stuff, and Bow. And somehow it's very, very visionary. Everything starts to resonate, especially near the Thames. If you walk up Limehouse Cut, you know, these big circular walks, walking by water, as we know, the elements, the marshy, muddy kind of earth, the light, the fire in your heart. Blake will come to you on those sort of walks. And if you're receptive enough, it will come. Every night and every morn, some to misery are born. Every morn and every night, some are born to sweet delight. Some are born to sweet delight.
Some are born to endless nights.
London was also a city in political ferment, fired by the revolutions in America and France. One night, Blake found himself swept up in the riot which led to the burning down of Newgate Prison.
He was both fascinated and at the same time rather appalled by the spectacle of licentious destruction of large swathes of London. I think it appealed to his imagination to see London put to the sword and the fire.
Out of the hope and the terror on the violent streets of London and Paris came Blake's most celebrated poem.
Tiger, tiger, burning bright, in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? In what distant deeps or skies burnt the fire of thine eyes? On what wings dare he aspire? What the hand dare seize the fire?
The tiger image was a common image applied to the revolutionary French people, particularly in 1792, at the time of the September massacres in France, when over 1,000 priests and aristocrats were massacred. And what Blake is agonizing about here is, this is history, the tiger. Lives are lost to create a better society.
What the hammer, what the chain? In what furnace was thy brain? What the anvil, what dread grasp dare its deadly terrors clasp? When the stars threw down their spears and watered heaven with their tears, did he smile his work to see? Did he who made the lamb make thee?
It's a deeply political poem. And you see, what many people don't understand is that politics and vision go together. And of course, if you're a Puritan, politics and religion are virtually the same thing.
A passionate Republican, Blake wrote a series of epic poems. He called them prophetic books, versions of history as sacred myth.
He transcribed events, but he changed them utterly. He turned them into symbolic dramas, battles of souls. In other words, the alchemy of his own imagination transformed them from the base metal of politics into the gold of imaginative resourcefulness. So they become both transcended and recognizable.
Blake's revolutionary sympathies made him an object of suspicion in London. At the invitation of a rich patron, he and Catherine moved to Felpham on the Sussex coast. He was offered a cottage in which to live and work. He was, to begin with at least, enchanted.
Why should I be anxious about the riches or the fame of mortality? I'm more famed in heaven for my works than I could well conceive. In my brain are chambers filled with books and pictures which I wrote and painted in ages of eternity before my mortal life. And those works are the delight and study of archangels.
But the visionary idyll was not to last, as the real world burst in with a vengeance. When a soldier billeted nearby wandered into his garden, the quick-tempered Blake was incensed and accused him of trespass. The soldier was a symbol of everything Blake hated: authority, war, and the rule of kings. Blake was ordered to appear for trial at Chichester Guildhall.
The charge was originally going to be high treason, And if you're convicted of high treason, you would have been hanged. There's no doubt about it. In fact, he was charged with sedition, which is trying to upset things, but not in quite so serious a way as treason. And sedition is rather undermining the state as against actually trying to blow it up. The people were very nervous in 1803. Napoleon troops were there on the other side of the channel, waiting. And it seemed only too likely that they would invade, which is why these soldiers have been brought down.
The question of Blake's guilt hung on what exactly he had said to the soldier, who accused him of praising Napoleon and damning the king.
Blake wasn't what we think of as a mystic. He was very tough. I mean, at 45, to pick up a soldier in your garden and run him down the street is not the mark of what we think of as a mystical person. He was very much an angry person. And the idea of Blake could have taken somebody by the scruff of the neck and run him down the road without saying anything at all seems to me improbable.
It's almost as if he had visited upon him the fate which he most feared, which was, in a sense, to stand out and to be accused.
Oh, why was I born with a different face? Why was I not born like the rest of my race? The pen is my terror, the pencil my shame. All my talents I bury, and dead is my fame.
I think partly his own self-possession and his sense of himself depended upon not being threatened, not being accused. And when it happened, he more or less went to pieces.
The verdict was not guilty. Blake was profoundly relieved. Increasingly, he turned away from building the New Jerusalem on earth, retreating into a world of obscurity and impenetrable mythology.
I must create a system, or be enslaved by another man's. I will not reason and compare. My business is to create.
Now that's very typically nonconformist. Don't agree with you, I'm going off to found my own church. The problem then is a certain batty eccentricity creeps into the writing, and you get all these mythic names and you don't know where you are. It's not like the Greek gods and goddesses. And that is one of the problems, I think, with Blake. But it's also a problem with the Protestant imagination. There's an anxiety in that imagination that it's not rich enough, it's not deep enough, it hasn't got enough mythic figures in it. And so he's creating his own church.
Even the familiar characters are not what we might expect them to be. God the Father is not a kindly creator, but a tyrant who has forced his will upon man. Satan, an energizing, necessary force. But while Blake reimagined the creation of the world took no notice.
I live by miracle, as to engraving, in which art I cannot reproach myself with any neglect. Yet I'm laid by in a corner as if I did not exist.
The more rejected he was by the world, the more he celebrated his triumphs in the spiritual kingdom. The more despised he was by the art critics and audiences of the 18th century, and the more he extolled his own spiritual virtues. So in a sense, his isolation turned him into a kind of prophet.
But at the age of 52, Blake decided to confront the world with his genius. He organized a one-man show at his brother's house in Soho. His exhibition featured work done over many years, including one which he called the spiritual form of Nelson.
When you look at the picture, of course, it says the spiritual form of Nelson, and instead of the familiar figure with one arm and one eye, you see this kind of muscle man who's sort of flexing himself and wearing a very scanty pair of bathing trunks, I suppose you could call them, separating all these extraordinary mythological creatures which come from the Bible and other places. So it really is something that is very hard to understand what on earth it's all about.
The exhibition was not a success. Almost nobody came.
His work exhibits the wild ebullitions of a distempered brain. Mr. Blake is an unfortunate lunatic whose personal inoffensiveness secures him from confinement.
But as Blake at last gave up hope of worldly recognition, his fortunes changed unexpectedly.
At the end of his life, which was difficult, demanding, poor, his clothes were dirty, he lived in one room off the Strand, he had the good fortune to be taken up by a group of young artists, amongst whom was Samuel Palmer. They called themselves the Ancients, and they believed in espousing the arts and virtues of the past rather than the present. And they found in Blake a figure whom they could revere.
They used to call his house the House of the Interpreter, and Samuel Palmer apparently used to kiss the doorknob when he went past. He felt such reverence for Blake.
It was a happy experience for him. He went on outings with them. He talked about ghosts with them. That was a great comfort and consolation to a man who, for the previous 40 or 50 years of his life, had been treated with contempt.
Blake was persuaded to have a life mask made of him. He impressed his new friends by drawing, as they appeared to him, a series of visionary people and creatures. He claimed to converse with them and gave them suitably intriguing titles.
The man who built the pyramids. The spirit of Voltaire. The man who taught Blake painting in his dreams.
There's a drawing by Blake called The Ghost of a Flea, a terrible sort of mask with fangs and a cup to hold the blood. And this is the ghost of a flea, which Blake saw in a vision and recorded it, recorded what he saw. And it's a marvellous nightmare figure, but it's also got a kind of comic slant on it. Blake had a sense of humour.
It's almost like some extraordinary sort of freak at a circus or something like that. It has that extraordinary quality. And maybe this even struck Blake because the flea is sort of coming on as though on a stage, one's almost saying, and now the amazing Mr. Flea. And there he is, sort of standing there with the curtains and all the rest and stars in the background. You do feel it's almost like a booth at a circus or something like that. And there I think he really was enjoying himself.
But Blake was himself preparing for death, impatient to join his visions.
I've been very near the gates of death, and have returned very weak, but not in spirit and life, not in the real man, the imagination which liveth forever.
He died on the 12th of August, 1827, at the age of 69, with Catherine beside him.
One of his disciples or apostles came after his death and made a point of closing Blake's eyes, as he said, to keep the vision in. But he really need not have done that because the vision itself has never died.
Blake's given me a lot. I love him more than any other person I've never met. Yeah. He'd given me an example about how it is possible to live an honest life in a corrupt society as an artist. He's shown me that it's possible to care about the suffering of the world and yet to be light-hearted. Because if you're heavy-hearted, you're no use to anyone much.
But as far as I'm concerned, the music I create is Blake music. So Blake is still alive. When I hear any words of beauty, it's Blake's words. That's where it comes from, not from some personal thing. It's the spirit within.
Academics talk about their subject, but Blake is not my subject. He has become my master in the Indian sense of the word, you know, the person from whom I have learnt, who has taught me that everyone, without exception, has the capacity for discovering the divine presence within ourselves.
I rest not from my great task to open the eternal worlds, to open the immortal eyes of man inwards into the worlds of thought, into eternity.
Inner City Life given a breath of fresh air, an award-winning breath of fresh air at that, courtesy of George the Poet. Back with a new series, Have You Heard George's Podcast? Blows in on BBC Sounds.